All right, CNT125, we're on our voice over IP module. We're talking a little bit of history of telephone. So we just left off talking about Elman Stroger here, and his invention, the phone switch. And that required the use of a rotary phone. And remember the rotary phone, as I dial this wheel around, to digit 5 and let it go, underneath there's a set of contacts that are going to literally make and break a connection 5 times. And that allowed those pulses of electricity to come to this relay that was part of the switch. And it would, if you dial the digit 5, it would send 5 pulses. This would click 5 notches. And that allowed you to start dialing the phone that you wanted without having the switchboard operator do it for you. So with the invention of this, and again, this comes along in 1890s, early 1900s, these start going into effect for people. We also have the need for people to understand how to use the rotary phone, because before you just picked it up and had the switchboard operator do it all. So literally before movies, there would be like a newsreel. There was a movie here that was shown on how to use your rotary phone. Pretty interesting concept. So now it allowed people to have individual phone lines to their house, and each house could pick up and dial who they wanted. Obviously using a phone book, they could still dial 0 to get an operator that would help them. That was in place for many years. Many years you could dial 0 and get an operator and get help for your phone call. But this now allows people to start dialing who they want. So as we move into the early 1900s, Bell Telephone Company, again, Alexander Graham Bell's phone company, Bell Telephone Company, acquires Western Electric, changed its name to AT&T. That should sound familiar. And here's the logos over the years, okay? In 1909, AT&T bought controlling interest in Western Union. Remember, Western Union was the big proponent and user of telegraph, and then you have Alexander Graham Bell's telephone coming along in the Bell Telephone Company. So you have Bell Telephone Company buying up interest in Western Union, its competitor, the telegraph. Now that maneuver of buying up your competition has the attention of the ICC, Interstate Commerce Commission. Their responsibility was oversight of American wire radio-based communication. ICC would eventually be passed, their responsibility would be passed to the FCC that we know today. We'll see that in just a minute. But AT&T was buying up its competitor, Western Union. Well, it didn't take long for that to come to light, and in 1913 there was an antitrust decision, Kingsbury Commitment, that forced AT&T to divest its holdings in Western Union. It's like, no, AT&T, your phone, Western Union, your telegraph, you two should do your own thing. And that forced AT&T to stop buying up the competition. And they were forced to actually provide free interconnection with other network providers, so they stopped being the, I'm using the word here, monopoly. 1914, first automatic switches, semi-automatic switches start going into effect, and these are these Stroger switches. These you can direct dial switches, if you will. And in here, it's slowly getting adopted. New Jersey, Nebraska, where in the early 20s, people could start picking up and dial the person they want to, and then make connection to who they want to. 1934, President Roosevelt created the FCC by signing into law the Communications Act of 34. Communications Act of 34 did a number of things. One was really try to put into play getting telephone lines to a lot of rural people. In addition, creating what we would call the FCC, Federal Communications Commission. So ICC kind of hands over that responsibility to FCC that we still have around today. But it isn't until like the 50s that long-distance dialing actually becomes a reality. Up until that point, if you want to make a long-distance call to like the next town or the next city, you still needed to connect to an operator, and they would make your connection for you. Anything local you could pick up and dial, but anything long-distance, you had to work through your operator to do so. So now we start having AT&T providing local and long-distance, and now they're owning, roughly 90% of the market share. AT&T is now back in the sights of the SEC again. It was in the sights before of ICC. Now it's in the sight of the FCC now again. I have a quick video here that shows literally these step-by-step switches in action. in the CO, showing you that as you dialed the first digit, it hit a first switch and would move its connections. And then as you dial the second digit, it makes connection to the second set of relays in line and moves, and makes connection to the third relays and moves, and so forth. And that's how you're able to make a direct connection, those relays routing your call for you. In the 60s, we have dual tone multi-frequency touch tone phones come along. These started replacing the use of rotary phones for many people, but it was kind of it came on the scene. A lot of businesses took advantage of it, and it slowly worked its way out to homes. Even in I'm thinking the 80s in my house, 1980s in my house, we still had rotary phone, and it wasn't probably till the 90s that we actually had a touch tone phone in our house. So it is something that slowly got adopted. But 1964, your dual tone multi-frequency, your touch tone phone comes into play. This actually used 2 frequencies to represent each tone. When they used a single frequency, what they found was background noise would accidentally dial numbers. So if somebody honked a horn behind you, that might dial number 9 when you picked up the phone on the street, if you will. So they created this dual tone where it was very hard to replicate those 2 tones with anything in public. So as you picked up the phone and dialed the digits, it was a unique sound combination that would be digit 1, digit 2, digit 3, and so forth. And that's where the touch tone, and here's the combination of frequencies that were used to get those tones. So now with the touch tone phones, what started happening is people's houses gets connected to a box in their neighborhood. They would call them slick boxes. So all the phones in the neighborhood would connect to a box, and sometimes you still see these around. If you look in a neighborhood, it might be about chin high and maybe as arms as you're wide when you spread them out. A brownish box in the neighborhood, sometimes silver. All the phones in that neighborhood would connect to there, and you would use a trunk line back to the CO, typically a T1 line. T1 line would allow you to combine 24 house phone calls together into one wire. That's what T1 lines would do. It did time division multiplexing. So it would take a little slice of house A phone call, a little slice of B, a little slice of C, and then would repeat, and would just do it very quickly. Boom, 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 and take those and multiplex them together onto the wire to the CO. The CO would take them back apart to individual phone calls. So you start getting this infrastructure in many areas, many places. And again, you'll still see some of these around if you look for them. The equipment inside has been updated to fiber and so forth, but this is kind of where that infrastructure started to come from. Well, if we look at businesses at this time, many businesses at this time would have many phones in their business. So making and receiving phone calls to do the business of that company. If you look at having individual phone lines, if I'm sitting here in my office and I call my neighbor's office, that phone call would literally get routed to the phone company CO and back. Well, it doesn't take long to realize that is kind of ridiculous, but it's also kind of costly, because I literally need to pay a phone line fee for every single one of those. And I just give you a super quick example. If I had 100 phones at $25 a month, and that's just a ballpark number from a handful of years ago, you're spending $2,500 a month in phone charges, if you will. So many companies in that time frame were like, no, we're going to do something better. They literally buy their own phone switch called a private branch exchange, PBX. And again, this is like 60s and 70s time frame after touch-tone phones come on the scene. Many companies would buy their own phone switch called a PBX, private branch exchange. What happens now is all the phones in the business connect to it, and that PBX connects to the phone company with a single trunk line, or maybe 2 trunk lines. Well, those trunk lines, again, I'm using numbers from a handful of years ago. The trunk line would be about $500 a month, as opposed to the $2,500 a month we were paying previously. So it doesn't take long to save a lot of money, and in a couple of years start paying for this switch that you bought. Because you're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars to buy the switch, but you're saving $2,000 a month. Give it a couple of years, boom, you paid for the switch. And many companies use these switches for like 20 or 30 years before replacing them. So they more than got their money's worth out of them. Well, that allowed the company here, all these phone calls that were internal literally get routed through the switch and doesn't cost them any money. So I could literally pick my phone up and dial Office 202 and talk to the person, Office 304, and direct dial and even transfer calls and all that kind of good stuff inside of my company. And only the calls that go outside were ones that were getting charged by the phone company, if you will. So this trunk line out here, T1 trunk line, could handle 24 simultaneous phone calls. And many companies, that was enough. So I would pick up my phone and dial like a digit 9, and that would get me a free outside line, and now I can make calls outside of my company. That's what your phone switch was doing. In those days, it was phone switch companies like Lucent, Northern Telecom or Nortel, ROM, NEC, GTE, Fujitsu, Hitachi, Mattel. These were all PBX manufacturers. Hack for quite a few years had a ROM phone switch that was used in all the offices to make and receive phone calls. I want to say they had the switch for about 30 years. And that's what they used. They had this PBX, this private branch exchange phone switch to process phone calls through. And here's the kind of thing it would look like with your phone blocks on the wall. These are the phone lines getting terminated to phone blocks. Those phone blocks get plugged into the phone switch here, and that's routing and receiving calls, if you will. Well, as we move into the 90s and we start getting that newfangled internet thing, we start having a network of routers and switches to connect to the ISP for data traffic, and many places still have this phone switch connected for phone traffic. Well, it doesn't take long for people to see that this is two networks of equipment. It seems like redundant. You know, somebody that's just on the business side of thing looking at numbers looks at this and goes, hey, this is redundant. Why are we paying for both of these? And for quite a while, you had a lot of good reason of like, well, hey, we can do all these things with our phone. We can call internal. We can talk external, long distance, etc., etc. And initially, your networks were not robust enough to handle all that phone traffic. But it didn't take long for bandwidths to catch up, the quality of equipment to catch up, some protocols to come along to handle quality of service, etc. Some features on switches to handle quality of service that in the early 2000s timeframe, for a lot of people, they started saying, you know what, I think we can route the phone traffic across the data network and get rid of this redundant connection over here that we're paying these two connections. We'll route everything through this single connection over here. So a lot of people in the very late 90s, early 2000s started looking at this as a possibility. The key to that was this IP PBX. So instead of a phone-based phone switch, it's an IP-based phone switch. So you can almost think of it as like a phone server, for lack of a better term. The phones in my existing phones in my network could connect to it. I need some ports on here to do so, but then this can also connect to my switch through the network card and route traffic through the data network and out. So a lot of places started adopting these that allowed them to migrate the old equipment to newer IP phones. And actually, IP PBXs initially can handle all those types of traffic. Handle the traditional analog phone if I had the ports for it, and also process the IP phone call traffic as well. These are some of the big players that came on the scene. These are still some that are around. That's why I use these. Cisco, 3CX, Asterisk. These are all manufacturers that came on the scene and are still big players in the IP phone market, the IP PBX phone market. Asterisk is a Linux-based one that many companies have taken the core of that and wrapped their own package around it. So you'll see a lot of companies, a lot of other company names out there like Free PBX and so forth that have the Asterisk Linux core, if you will. Okay, so just a little side note on that one. So these IP PBXs, I could buy analog cards to snap into them, and I can plug my analog phones in. I can even use a card here that would handle 24 phone calls. I could actually have a 66 block plug into this and handle all my analog phone calls. And I could also snap in a digital card, and this would allow me to connect to a T1 line if I needed that. Or E1 if I'm over in Europe. So there's a lot of flexibility when these early IP PBXs is on. I just buy the card I need to snap in there to make my connection. Now some of the cards were pricey, but I could use existing equipment with this card and not have to replace all the phones or even maybe the phone line if you were still using that. Alright, when we come back in the next one, we'll start talking some beginnings of IP phone.